if you're motivated by money and money alone, or status or authority, what will happen is over time, once you fulfill those desires and needs, you'll naturally stagnate and plateau because you'll have no reason to continue working. Today, I'm going to share with you a revelation, paradigm shift, epiphany, whatever word you want to use to describe huge change in thought pattern and process, huge change in my life. And it's happened recently, very recently. And I'm pretty convinced that this is the thing that's going to help me make $100 million. I've thought long and hard about this, and it's just an awesome, beautiful thing that you can do as well. And I wish I'd done this when I was starting out, and I wish I knew this when I was starting out. So what I'm going to do today is explain what this is and like what I've done and how I've been working on my mindset to make a shift that's so extreme that it kind of has completely changed my life and my behavior and the way I operate. My name's Charlie Morgan. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I've built and scaled 2 companies, a marketing agency to 7 figures, which I've sold, and a coaching business to multi-7 figures, which I still run. This video and this channel is basically designed to help you to grow your company if you sell like a high-ticket B2B service. But either way, I'm going to hop into this video and miro out what this change is and explain how it's had probably more of an impact on my life mindset-wise than almost anything else I've ever done, which is a pretty big claim because I've worked on my mindset pretty much every day for like 6 years. So I'm going to hop in and show you in Miro now. Okay, so let's get straight into it. So this basically revolves around trauma. I need to actually zoom in a little bit here because otherwise you're not going to be able to read anything. So let's just adjust the sizes. Now you're seeing Maslow's hierarchy of needs on the screen. Before you roll your eyes and wonder why I'm talking about such a basic foundational knowledge of psychology, I'm going to explain how this has changed my life, right? So, okay, it revolves around trauma, right? Now let me explain what this looks like. First things first, you have to understand that if you want to be an entrepreneur and start your own company and build your own thing, you are weird, right? You're weird and you're abnormal. So, you know, you're going to be these 2 things. You're weird and you are abnormal. That's fine because everyone thinks weird is a bad thing, but it's actually kind of cool, right? But you're kind of strange because like 99% of people, like they just want to have like a home, right? And a family, and you know, that's it. That's all they really want, right? It's just like a, you know, nuclear family, or that's all they think they want, right? To want something different to that is strange, it's weird, it's abnormal, and it's fine to want those things, and it's beautiful you want those things. But you've got to realize that what you want, like whether it's like, you know, whether you want to have like a home, or whether you want to make a shitload of money and have a company and, you know, be able to go and, you know, sit on a beach somewhere, it's supposed to be a palm tree, by the way, but sit on a beach somewhere and, you know, just work on your laptop or whatever that looks like, right? Anyway, you get the point. Whether you want different things will depend on your emotional state and basically like how you've been programmed and what's happened to you. I'm going to talk from my experience here. So I don't know if this will work for you. I can only tell you what's worked for me and use this platform as a vehicle for me to explain my processes and what's worked for me, and hopefully you derive some value from it. So we know that like wanting to start a business is kind of weird. It's kind of abnormal. It's not like straightforward, typical behavior of individuals in the current day and age. It's becoming more common because it's becoming more popular, but it's kind of fucking weird, right? So let's talk about like the whole $100 million thing. So to make $100 million, right, you kind of have to be pretty fucking good at something. And you have to be so good at it that enough people trust and believe in you, and you have to add so much value. Let's talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So at the bottom here, these are basically considered the like 5 core needs of a human being, right? And they sort of go in order. And what this means is that like if you don't have basic physiological needs met, all you will think about, all your limbic system will think about is physiological needs. So like you can have like you could have a huge mansion, a Lamborghini, any amount of women you wanted, and feel like you're on top of the world. But if you're thirsty and you haven't drunk any water for like 12 hours, then all your body's going to be thinking about is that need. It won't be worrying about fulfilling any other need or desire you have. It will just be worried about fulfilling the desire of like water. Or if you haven't got a place to sleep, but you're mega rich, like that's all your body will be thinking about, right? Same with safety needs, right? You know, if you could have everything you want in the world, but if you don't feel like you're safe and secure, then your body will be focused on that, which is kind of obvious, right? Now, here's where things get interesting, because I became very blind to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because I used to study it and I used to think, yep, obvious, like, I used to believe I was at self-actualization, right? Okay, because I thought this and I was like, right, well, I've ticked the box of physiological needs because, like, I live in a first world country. I'm fortunate enough to have a loving family. So, these things are taken care of. I'm not homeless, basically. I've clean water. I've got shelter, right? So that was something I never had to worry about, is that. Now, where things got a little interesting is safety needs, right? So safety needs, I thought, well, I'm fine. I've got good health, touch wood, right? God forbid, whatever. I had anything bad happen to me, but I've got good health. I've got a good job. I'm personal security, resources, property. So like I've got all of these things lined up, and this is me, by the way, only like 3 months ago. So I'm not talking about like before, but that's fine. Love and belonging taken care of, right? I've got a sense of connection. I have a great relationship with my family. I've got lots of friends that I love, and I've got an intimate relationship with my girlfriend. We're happy, right? And then esteem. I'm like, okay, well, I respect myself because I've done well. I've got good self-esteem and good confidence. I feel like I've got some status because I've got money and cars and shit. Recognition, strength, and freedom. Like, okay, yeah, I've got these things. And like the idea is that once you have these things met, then your mind can actually produce self-actualization. And self-actualization is basically where you go beyond yourself. You go beyond your needs, and you no longer have needs for yourself. You start taking care of other people's needs. And that's how I see it. It might be wrong, but that's sort of how I've developed it. So how does this all tie in, right? So I thought I was at self-actualization, right? You're doing like 200K a month or whatever. Like, you sell an agency doing 7 figures, and, you've got all of the money in the world for a young guy. And then you've got all of this status and respect, and you've got a good relationship. Everything's going good, right? But what I noticed is that even though I thought I had all these things, I would still sabotage myself. Right? Now, self-sabotage is kind of like a natural thing, but like I wanted to address this self-sabotage thing because I've been sabotaging myself on and off, not as much nowadays, but it's still kind of prevalent, that it manifests itself in like, oh, I don't want to do the work today, or like this will happen. And like, I'm usually able to push through it, but sometimes it gets the better of me. I'm being vulnerable. It happens to all of us, right? If we're all being honest. There's nobody that doesn't like get attacked by self-sabotage until they've addressed what I'm going to tell you. So the key to overcoming self-sabotage is basically what I'm about to share with you. So I would always sabotage myself. I would always be like, oh fuck, and I'd always come back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and be like, well, why? Like, why am I self-sabotaging if I've got, all of these basic needs, and I've got this desire to become the best I can be, whatever the fuck that means? Why do I go through these periods of regression, and why do I rut myself through? Like, even if I didn't have like love and belonging and esteem needs, like why would I self-sabotage, right? So let me sort of explore this, right? So it comes down to trauma, right? And then this is where things get pretty fucking deep and pretty interesting. And like I'm going to be like really vulnerable with you guys here and tell you a story, something that's happened to me in the last couple of months that has massively changed my life. And it's quite an emotional thing. It's not necessarily appropriate to share to thousands of people on YouTube, but I feel like if I can help someone else do what I've done and get my point across and help you change your life potentially, then it's going to be worth it. So it comes down to trauma, right? And it comes down to basically addressing shit that's happened to you in your life, right? So how am I going to make $100 million with trauma, right? Well, there's this thing called post-traumatic growth, right? And basically, when something traumatic happens to a person, right? Like, when something bad basically just manifests in their life, the human being has to process that trauma, right? And that trauma has to go through like, a process in their mind of processing, right? It's pretty obvious. What happens is one of two things, right? What most commonly happens is the trauma gets repressed, right? And this will all link in back in a bit, I promise. The trauma gets repressed, right? And like what happens is you repress the trauma to your unconscious. I'll tell you all about my trauma in a second, don't worry. But you repress the trauma to your unconscious mind, and basically you forget about it. Now, you don't realize you forget about it because it's unconscious, right? But the problem is what happens is when you repress this, basically you produce another little version of yourself here in your unconscious mind. And this little version of yourself locks into this cycle of limbo and is psychologically convinced that it's still going through that trauma. Even though you don't know it exists, right? And so, like, when you experience, like, you know, a random manifestation of emotion up through your brain, like, what's happening is one of these little guys in your unconscious is trying to communicate something to your conscious mind. And that's what emotion is it's like, it's your unconscious trying to tell you something most of the time. And like, this is what I realize about self-sabotage, because self-sabotage almost always starts with an emotion, right? It's complacency, or it's fear, or it's pain, or there's always some sort of emotion, either perceived negative sentiment or perceived positive sentiment, that creates and generates self-sabotage, almost always. So I looked into this and I was like, well, okay, well, we understand. I sort of looked into the emotional thing. I was like, what is emotion? And like, what is the emotion that leads us to taking an action, or, you know, because it's emotion, right? Motion is movement. So emotions by their nature encourage us to act. So what like, I've tried to convince, like, wonder, like, why is part of me convincing myself to act in a way that isn't conducive, if anything, is completely the opposite of what I want, right? This is where it gets fucking deep. Right. So I learned something, I learned about something called shadow work, right? Because I've studied Carl Jung for a long time. But I learned about something called shadow work. And shadow work is basically where you work with a coach, or like a therapist, or someone that can get into your mind. And you basically explore, like, this little part of yourself, right? You find the version of you that was buried away when something traumatic happened to you. And you seek to understand it and integrate its needs and desires and bring it to your conscious awareness and attention. And I've done this, and it is the most beautiful thing I've ever done, ever, period. Like, it's the most awesome thing. I'm going to explain, like, how. So, okay, this all comes back down to why you want to start a company, right? Because as you remember, we sort of, you know, label entrepreneurs as weird, right? We're strange, we're abnormal. It's not particularly common or, like, normal to want to start a company. So why do we do it? Well, like, why we want to do things is typically going to depend on, like, our emotions, right? And so we are mostly driven by emotional means. So, for example, narcissism, ego, anger, shame, whatever that looks like. I can tell you that the reason I started my first company was basically out of anger, shame, and, like, lust, you know, and pride, right? Or lack thereof. And, like, all of these emotions, whether negative or positive, pushed me towards developing a company and building a future for myself that gave me more power, more control, and basically gave my life more fulfillment and more meaning. And I really polarized myself to these emotions, and I really let them sort of dictate my actions, which was a good thing because it obviously led to me building a company. So this is post-traumatic growth, right? When you feel an emotion that generates a top level emotion such as anger or pride or narcissism, or, you know, some sort of, like, what would we call it? Some sort of, like, emotional fragility, and that leads you to take action, then you're experiencing post-traumatic growth. Now, here's the thing. When someone processes trauma, right, they repress it into their unconscious, and then one of two things can happen, right? So option number one is basically, like, what would we call it? Like, because, like, I can tell you option number two, right? Option number two is growth, right, and development, right? And this is where, like, part of you, or your soul, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, basically grows and develops to overcome the trauma. Or your trauma basically leads you to growing. So, like, when you, okay, and then the second thing, let's just call death, right? It's not really death, like, you're not physically dying, but it's death and, like, you know, we'll say decay, right? Something that basically is the antonym of growth and development. When you experience trauma, typically you will repress that trauma, and you will take a piece of yourself and push it into your unconscious, and forever that piece of yourself will be convinced it's still going through the trauma, even though you're not aware of it. That piece of yourself will manifest emotions and generate feelings and desires and urges that will dictate your behavior without your awareness, right? Now, those emotions can lead you to taking one of two routes. You can take the death and decay route, or you can take the growth and development route. If you want to start a business and you want to, you know, you feel like you're not enough, or you feel like you're powerless, or you're out of control, or you're sick and tired of what you're doing, or you're angry at the system, then you are experiencing post-traumatic growth. So the fact you're on this YouTube video in the first place indicates to me that you're experiencing growth and development, which is a good thing. What a lot of people experience is death and decay. And this is where they experience emotions that lead them to seeking escape, right? It's where like the part of themselves they've repressed. I can't tell you the difference between these two, why it happens, because I don't know. I haven't researched it enough. But some people, what happens is it manifests in a way where they start turning to negative things that don't produce growth, things that produce death and decay, drugs, gaming, porn, gambling, drinking. It's like a common one of this could be like alcohol, right? So like, to cope with your trauma, you've either got the pain of business, right, or the pain of alcohol, right? It's kind of like, one of the two things. You might have both. It can manifest in both ways in the same individual. But like, if you want to start a business, like you're starting the business out of an emotional desire, and if you're doing the thing and you feel like you're doing something to move away from an emotion, then it's that. But if you're doing something just to try and avoid an emotion or ignore an emotion, then it's number one, right? Now, number one is far more common in this world because a lot of people turn towards drinking and drugs and anything they can to take their mind off of feeling how they feel. And a lot of people don't know why they're alcoholics or why anything like that manifests, but it's almost always because something's happened to them that's so bad that they've repressed it and they've forgotten about it, but then that part of them is still convinced that, it's kind of like when something traumatic happens, it's like your mind and your body takes a screenshot of that moment, like a video GIF screenshot of the traumatic moment for however long that might be, like days or months or weeks or whatever. And it locks that image in your brain and just keeps replaying it over and over again to your unconscious. And it produces these emotions which basically encourages you to act in a certain way. And this gets really deep, right? So like, luckily enough, like I was able to go through growth. But however, number one for me, when I basically, okay, let me tell you about what happened to me, right? And how this sort of manifests, because obviously I'm sort of going off in some circles. So when I was about 11 years old, between the ages of 11 and 12, I was heavily bullied, right? I was bullied pretty bad in secondary school. So that's like the equivalent of the start of high school. So I was in year 7 when I started school. Now, at this point, I had no friends. I was pretty, that's supposed to say friends, but I was pretty weak and skinny. And, I was basically a very easy target for bullies, right? If this was me, I was tiny, this would be everybody else at the school. And I was basically isolated on my own. So like, people could just take advantage of that, right? It's human nature, it's biology. I've kind of come to accept that. But what happened is I went through a year of my life where I was just heavily like bullied, right? Verbally, physically. I remember I would like to avoid going out into the playground because like I didn't want to see anyone because they just pick on me. Like I'd literally take my lunch and go and eat it in like a toilet cubicle, and I'd always sit outside the staff room because that's where I felt safest, where no one could get to me. And like, it was a pretty bad time for like a year. And this happened to me when I was like 11, but I kind of forgot about it. I didn't really like recognize it. I completely forgot that it happened. And, there wasn't anything that like, I can't really recall. I mean, I can recall it. I have recalled it. I've worked on bringing the emotions back, and it's been really helpful. And I'll explain how I've done that soon. But this happened to me for like a whole year. And what this did is it basically created this feeling of powerlessness. And what happened over the course of a year is I basically every day would like, in the moment it was horrible. I remember it was awful for that year. But in the years that followed, I kind of just repressed it. Like I kind of just forgot about it and just moved on with my life, and I just put it down. That was a bad year. It wasn't much fun, but it's happened and I'm over it. Wrong, right? The reason I was able to say I was over it is because I'd repressed it. But for basically 12 months of my life, I was powerless. And what I mean by that is like I was basically lonely. I was like bitter, and I felt shame because I had no, as an 11, 12-year-old kid, if you've got no power, like you feel like you're useless. So I felt pretty worthless. I felt pretty powerless. And that was awful, and it manifested for a whole year. And I feel sorry for the guy that happened to. But what happened here is like I experienced number one, right? And we know that number one is death and decay. And basically I turned to video games. So I turned to video games basically from the age of like 11 to really like 18. I was just completely addicted to video games. Every single night, every single day, all my waking moments would just be consumed by video games when I wasn't at school. It was all I did. It was my entire life and personality for like 17 years. And that was it, basically. And so like, here's the interesting thing, right? I got to 18 And when I got to 18, I started to experience post-traumatic growth, right? I had enough of the gaming and my motivation switched. I switched away from, because gaming for that long is traumatic in and of itself, right? Because, it doesn't really lead to many healthy habits. And so what I did is I basically started building a company. Long story short, I built my first agency, blah, 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 right? But this is how it's manifested in me. And now what happened is it wasn't until 24, which is where I am now, that I've actually started to get to grips with this self-sabotage thing. So it all comes back down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And what's happened is I've been able, I wondered, well, why, if I'm at self-actualization and I tick every box below this, then why am I still self-sabotaging? Why do I still go through periods of regression and doubt and self-hatred and shit like that? Here's the thing, right? So here's me, right? In my day and age, at 24. And here's me at, 11 years old, right? And this person's very sad, right? This person exists, but inside of this person also exists this person without this person knowing it. So for basically, 13, 14 years, I've been operating with a psychological parasite inside of me, essentially, is how you want to look at this thing. It doesn't kill its host. It doesn't let its host know it's there, but it just lives inside the host and you don't know it's there. So trauma creates a psychological parasite, right? And so here's me, and I see myself as this, strong entrepreneur doing cool things, right? However, unconsciously, a small part of myself sees myself as a powerless 11-year-old child who's lonely, who has no friends, who's worthless, who is worthy of guilt and shame and self-hatred. And also, doesn't like himself. So I wasn't aware that this person still existed. It's really weird to explain how this works, but basically if you've been through something traumatic and you haven't properly processed it, I can guarantee you that there's a little part of yourself in your mind and your psychology that is replaying that experience over and over again unconsciously, and through the repetition and the replaying of that experience is creating emotions to lead to either growing or dying, right? So, what happened is I learned that this person existed, and what I did is I thought, I'm at self-actualization, why am I not growing? And this is the key point of this video. And basically it's because I thought I was at self-actualization, but there was a part of me, a deep psychological unconscious part of me that I didn't know existed, that didn't have personal security needs met, that didn't have proper health needs met because, I was bruised pretty commonly, didn't have any friendship needs, didn't have any intimacy needs, didn't have a sense of connection, had no self-respect, had no self-esteem, no status, no recognition, no strength, and absolutely no freedom. Obviously I had these physiological needs, but this person here, the 11-year-old version of me that existed, which is still part of me, which is still me essentially, was nowhere near self-actualization. So I polarized an identity and created a sense of self and a character that could protect this 11-year-old child. And almost every action I have taken between 18 and 24 was to build a life that allowed me to escape feelings of powerlessness and worthlessness. And I've done that, right? And that's basically why I figured out that's why I've done what I've done. I thought it was for money and for status and for cars and shit, but if you look at the deeper level and keep asking why, you get down to this bottom, right? Which is how I got here. It's why do I want money? Well, I want to be free. Well, if you want to be free, there's an indication that you're constrained. Why do you feel constrained? And you just keep going down and down and you find these vacuums that you need to find, like drive vacuums, emotional vacuums. This is where it gets deep, right? So I was like, okay, well, I'm trying to self-actualize, but for some reason, I keep self-sabotaging. I knew that self-sabotage happens when you're not meeting one of these needs, because if your behavior is taking you in a different direction to what you want it to take, it's probably because it's trying to meet an unmet need, that your body's trying to meet a need that you haven't met. And you might think that you've met all these needs, but secretly there's probably a kid inside of you pulling your strings and pulling your emotions like a puppet and just, taking you in different directions. So I was here and I thought I was here, right? But I build myself up
to a certain high where I'd be consistent and make shitload of money, and then I'd break myself down, and this happened for basically like 5 years, right? The oscillation where I'm like, I'm so confident and relaxed and I'm making so much money, and then down here I hate myself and I've made nothing and I've done nothing and I'm just a worthless piece of shit. The reason this happened, and the reason I'd oscillate between, extreme confidence and extreme like doubt and self-hatred, is because like I've got this 11-version-year-old of myself that fundamentally believes and is convinced that he's powerless and worthless. And so it's impossible for me to behave like this at this peak for a particularly long period of time, because part of me is convinced that we should be here. So I've got this polarized identity that I've created that believes it should be here, but I've got an unconscious other polarized identity that believes it should be down here. And so if you experience like waves of like progress like this, where 1 minute you're on top of the world and the next minute you don't think you can do it, it's because there's a part of you, a string, someone pulling strings, or this is how it's worked for me, it might not be for you, but there's a part of you that's pulling strings that is convinced that you should be down here and you shouldn't be up here, right? So I broke this code and I managed to integrate this 11-year-old version of myself. Look at him, very sad boy, right? With his little birthmark there, no friends, right? I convinced myself to do this, and it was painful, but once I did this, let me explain the process, right? So it comes down to actually processing the trauma that you've experienced. And I don't think I've done this in full yet. I'm still working on it, but let me tell you a story. So yeah, it's a little bit difficult to talk about because it's not like particularly, it's not much fun to readdress, but here goes, because it might save you like it saved me. So there's nothing wrong with being emotional and vulnerable as a man, from my perspective. So what I had to do is I had to sit in a room by myself and shut my eyes. And I had to take myself back, and I had to go back to those tragic or traumatic memories of who I was and what I experienced. And I had to go back and reimagine being beaten up and reimagine being manipulated and verbally abused, and rethink of the times where I would take my sandwich box to the bathroom and eat in a stool, or knock on the teacher's office to see if I could do anything. I had to just sort of take myself back. And when I took myself back there, I started to feel the emotions that came with that. And it started with a top level emotion of anger and hatred that I would feel towards the people perpetrating like the bullying on me. But then eventually I just started to pity the guy. And I say the guy, it's me, but like I started to realize that, this person who had been through so much was strong. And that's a weird thing to sort of realize, but like basically I cried, right? And I haven't properly cried. I mean, I've cried at different things like certain films or like homecoming military videos, but never like properly. With this, like I imagined it, and I sort of was thinking about it and taking myself back to those experiences and processing them and feeling the emotions and not trying to escape them or analyze them, just basically putting myself in the first person of that kid and just basically experiencing what he was experiencing. And I started processing all of that trauma with the emotional maturity that I have as an advantage as an adult. So he didn't know how to deal with it back then. I didn't know how to deal with it back then. And then I cried a little bit, like some tears came out, and I felt this strong sense of emotion, like this sadness, this pity, this, I don't know what you could call it. And I went downstairs to see my girlfriend, and she was like, "Are you okay?" And then I was just like, "No." And then I just basically bawled my eyes out. For about 45 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes, I was just crying. Like, and I don't mean like little tears, like full on, like, when someone cries like so hard that they like shake, and like, it was like that. But it was the most like relieving alleviation. It was beautiful. And it was like, I was so like, I started saying as I was crying, I was like, I'm so glad that I'm so proud of myself that I've built a life that I've built a life to protect this child and to protect him and to take care of him and take him under my wing and make sure that he's taken care of. And I don't want, I never want to go through that again. I don't want anyone to go through that again. And I want my work to help no one ever go through that again. And, it was just a very, very emotional 45 minutes of just pure crying. And like, I've never done that before. And it basically was like, it was a very strong, overwhelming emotion. And it was very scary because I've never been out of control of my emotions before. And it wasn't until I processed it that afterwards I felt so much better. And it was kind of like I'd gone down through the processing of that emotion and crying and letting it out, so to speak. It was like I've gone down into the depths of my unconscious, found that, 11-year-old version of myself that was fundamentally convinced he was still being bullied, and pulled him to the light and just said, hey mate, look at what you've done. Look at what you've produced and look at the life you've created. And that experience you had is the reason you've been able to flourish and grow so much. And I kind of just opened his eyes and just showed him like, hey, that's not the reality anymore. We've taken care of that, and it's no longer what you have to experience. And that gave me this like sense of like, holy fucking shit, like the meaning, the clarity, I can't explain it. I can't explain it in verbal form. I can feel it, but I can't explain it. But doing that, so now that I've done that, I'm actually at self-actualization. Now, there might be other things I have to process, but ever since I've done that, I've stopped self-sabotaging. I've stopped going to extremes, and my progress has been way more linear by nature. It's just been like this, right? Instead of being like this, like most people's progress is, where they go up and then they come down, and it trends upwards, but it's just so painful. Like mine's kind of just been like a little bit of a dip here, a little bit of an up here. Like it's been going up, but just without like extreme, like there's none of this, and then it comes up and then it goes up, and then, that's what my progress now looks like. And like the reason it does that is because I'm no longer self-sabotaging, because I've opened the eyes of the 11-year-old version of myself that was perpetrated on and believed that he was a victim. Fundamentally, for basically the first 5 to 6 years of my entrepreneurial career, part of me was convinced I was powerless, victimized, and worthless, and lonely, and angry, and shameful. And those emotions would manifest when I take myself to a high, and I take myself to a point of confidence where I could work so much, and then I break myself down because I had no choice, because I fundamentally believed I was worthless. So why would I keep working to something that would generate worth in myself? And it was through processing this and taking this, this kid basically who was convinced that he was in a world of hell, and showing him that that's not the case. That, we now have, he's now got friends, he's now got intimacy and family, a sense of connection. He's now got self-respect, because even though he's been through this, he's developed respect for himself, and he's got esteem and status and recognition and strength and freedom. And he's now secure, right? He's got property, he's got resources and employment and health, and, he's got all of these needs met as well. And as soon as he realized that, that's the integration process through shadow work, basically, is you take a part of yourself that is disconnected from your current polarized identity. And your current polarized identity will have been created to take care of this thing inside of you. So if I hadn't been bullied, and if this hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here talking to you today and starting a company. I wouldn't be anywhere near as successful as I was. So I am extremely grateful for the pain and the suffering that was inflicted upon me, or that I inflicted upon myself through perception of someone inflicting it upon me. Stoicism for you. And I'm grateful for it, because it created this life that I now know and live. And it's a wonderful thing to process that, and to really take yourself back there and process the emotions. And once you do that, any part of yourself that's operating at trying to fill any of these needs will basically dissipate. And so now, as soon as I did this, and as soon as I integrated this part of myself and actually processed this trauma, I've made more money and made more progress in my company than ever before, right? I've crafted our company's mission. I've built a full-on plan for the company. We're taking it in a completely different direction. And basically, I'm now free and able to operate unencumbered by an 11-year-old child who's emotionally fucked. It's almost like every decision I've ever made, every action I've ever taken is underpinned by this, child that doesn't want what I think I want, right? So that's how it worked for me. I'm surprised I made it through this video without crying, to be honest with you, because when I've talked about this before, I usually get quite emotional. But I want you to know that it's all right to be emotional, right? And not to the point where you let those emotions, dictate your life and force you to, or encourage you, or make you take action that compromises your integrity or your value system. But it's okay to process things. It's okay to feel things, and it's all right that you've got these things inside of you that need to be addressed, because it's natural. And if you want to start a company and this is how things are manifesting, it's really important that you start addressing this, because think about it. Why do you want money? Why do you want money? Well, it's because you want something. Why do you want something? Because you didn't have something as a child, almost always, right? So that's everything for the video. I'd like you to comment below, if you feel brave enough, what you think of this video and if it's been useful for you. It might be one of the most important ones I've ever made, mostly for my own, to getting it off of my mind and my own psychological baggage. So sorry I put this on you. But I'd also encourage you to like the video and subscribe, because if you do that, other people will see this video and it might help them if it helped you. That's everything for this video. I hope you found it really useful. It's an important message that, like, this will make me more money than any cold email script ever, basically. This will make me more progress and more sales than anything at all, really. It's how I'm going to make $100 million, probably $1 billion. It's going to take a long time, but I'm now like free to operate as a individual that has, what's the word? Is it solidarity? What's that word? I can't remember. Anyway, you get the point. I'm kind of tired after like a long, deep video like this. What's that word? It's going to annoy me. Anyway, basically, I'm free to operate unencumbered of an 11-year-old emotional child that's convinced he's powerless and worthless, right? So that's everything. I hope you enjoyed the video. Talk to you later. Cheers.